I'm really both glad and honored to introduce from First Draft their head of global partnerships, Marie Bohner, who will talk to us about the ecosystem of international disinformation. Marie manages First Draft's global partnerships. She started working with First Draft on Crosscheck France in 2017 for the French presidential election. She coordinated the collaboration of media, academic, and tech partners on the project. As both French and German citizen, she has assisted First Draft with partner meetings in Germany, France, the UK, and the Council of Europe. She has been working with First Draft's European partners since March last year, and with the global network since 2019 as well. I'll stop right there. You are so welcome, Marie. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. So I will try to make the magic work and share my screen to my slides. Just a minute. So let me see how this can work. So are you seeing my slides? Yes?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you to everyone and to Kirsty and Annelie for inviting me to give you some insights to understand the global framework of mis and disinformation. I will also take this opportunity to give you a few hints on how to slow its spread in the digital space. 2020 is such a strange year. With the pandemic, but also with elections, such as the US presidential race, we have seen the levels of mis and disinformation rise to unprecedented peaks at times where credible information was and is still crucial to the general public. As journalists or as researchers, as civil society or as family members, how can we all cope with that? I hope to give you some keys to kick off your conversations for the next 2 days on this crucial aspect of our contemporary digital era. We are all part of the problem in the way we keep on sharing information online. But because of that, we can also try to all be part of the effort for a healthier information ecosystem. So that's the general frame. I will gladly answer your questions after this presentation, so do not hesitate to note them down. So I also wanted to give you a very short introduction about who we are at First Draft, because all of you maybe don't know about us. So as said on the slide, at First Draft, we work to empower people with the knowledge, understanding, and tools needed to build resilience against harmful, false, and misleading information in the moments that matter. We do that by providing training for newsrooms and other organizations, but also by doing research and initiating and supporting collaborative information networks. Now, let me introduce myself. My name is Marie Bohner. I'm Global Head of Partnerships at First Draft, as Annelie expressed. I am French and German, so I'll ask for your understanding as my English is far from perfect. So when we talk about partnerships at First Draft, it has to do with the fact that we work a lot with media organizations, as I was saying, around the world, to train them on online information disorder, but also to initiate some collaborative work to identify misinformation trends and narratives, for example. We also work with universities, researchers, but also NGOs and institutions such as UNICEF, for example, because health-related misinformation has become a major issue for all of these actors now. If you, as journalists or as researchers, are interested in our collaborative work around these topics, do not hesitate to get in touch with me after this conference. We are eager to have more contacts with Swedish organizations, so really do not hesitate. So why is disinformation so common in the digital space? Who benefits from it? To tackle the issue of information disorder, we have to understand it better, analyze its ways and the actors who participate in its creation, the messages and the sources. This is what one of our two directors, Claire Wardle, has developed in an essential guide for First Draft called Understanding Information Disorder, which you can find on our website. A first basic thing to know about is this. Are you using the idiom fake news? If so, what are you using it for? To describe what? Let us take a moment to think about it. When was the last time you used it? The term is basically everywhere. In French, it is even used as such, I mean, in its English version, fake news, as if it would define something more specific when said in English. Well, we would like to ban these words when we are talking about online information disorder. And here's why. First of all, because it's not precise. It does not describe any specific type of information and only leads to more vagueness and thus helplessness in the analysis of the problem. It's also because most of the time when we are talking about fake news, we are not even talking about a piece of news, but it could be better framed probably as online chatter, for example, rather than news. And last but not least, because this term of fake news is used by politicians and bad actors to discredit the media organizations themselves, especially when they are reporting on actual disinformation. There are other ways to talk about these matters in a much more efficient way, and I hope to show it to you in this presentation. An essential aspect to understand information disorder is the role played by emotions. As you can read in this sentence, our brain has a tendency to absorb more of a content if it's highly emotional. Anger, outrage, and the need to protect are key elements to the dissemination of online information. This is well known by bad actors, meaning people who are voluntarily creating and spreading disinformation online, who take advantage of this to trigger more likes and shares. The fact that the pandemic generated such a high level of misinformation is thus not surprising, and bad actors have been playing on the climate of uncertainty and distress to fuel all sorts of strong feelings with conspiracy theories. 5G, COVID-19, or vaccines are all breeding ground topics for mis and disinformation because they are directly related to our daily lives. They are easy triggers for emotional reactions. This is why this is a question we should always ask ourselves before sharing anything online. What is my emotional reaction to this content? Do I have any bias on this subject matter? How does it fit my worldview, my own worldview, and my way of life? Now, here are some important characteristics that we found around mis and disinformation. Lots of rumors circulate in local groups and online spaces. Closed messaging apps are increasingly popular and thus something to look at very seriously and investigate. Visuals and memes are compelling vehicles for information because they are fueling emotions. Effective misinformation often involves a kernel of truth, and that's central to every kind of rumor or misinformation that wants to be a bit successful. And scammers capitalize on misinformation and disinformation to sell things. Money is one of the biggest motivations to create online information disorder. I want to insist particularly on the power of memes, these texts on images that are spreading like wildfire on social media. They are more difficult to investigate for fact checkers as they mix image and text, or sometimes only image, but they are more geared towards emotion rather than information. They also flirt between humor and information. But as any other type of message, they convey information and can just contribute to online information disorder. When you look at the meme with John Lennon and Yoko, which circulated a lot last spring, can you see how it contributed to a growing anti-Asian sentiment at the beginning of the pandemic in Europe and the US? Images are, as I said, extremely powerful vectors of emotion. I explained previously how we are choosing not to use the term fake news. Here is a possible alternative which involves more granularity and specifications in relation to the source and the message. Misinformation is when a false information is shared with no intention to harm or deceive, which is the case, most of the case. Disinformation is when false information is shared and created with an intention to deceive. Malinformation is when true information, such as leaks, for example, or revenge porn, are shared with an intention to harm. These categories are all part of what Claire Waddle defines as online information disorder, and we are using them to build out our monitoring and our investigations. Claire Waddle also defined 7 types of mis and disinformation within this framework to make our understanding more detailed and specific. You can see on this slide that the types go all the way down from satire and parody to fabricated content. Let me give you some example, which I hope will demonstrate why it is essential to enter this kind of granularity in the understanding of information disorder. Satire and parody are essential to healthy democratic dialogue. As a French and as a German, I can only support this idea. The problem comes when satire is shared without the understanding of the humor contained in it, because it's cultural, because it's local, because it needs a context. When it's taken seriously, when it's taken as an actual piece of news. That happens frequently on social media when satire is shared out of context or with a false context even. It can be then highly inflammatory and misleading. We also saw during the pandemic some false connections being made between causes and effects, especially when it comes to symptoms of the pandemic and possible remedies. You might remember that during last spring, a rumor circulated online pretending that alcohol could prevent and or cure COVID-19. We then heard about 40 people dying in Iran because they drank adulterated alcohol, thinking that it could protect them from the disease. Misinformation, and we should never forget that, has real life impact. You can see on this slide an example of what we call false context, a very common and efficient technique of disinformation on social media. The same image has been used in an original article to describe flight path, but was then repurposed on social media, pretending to describe how the virus would have been traveling from Wuhan to other locations in the world. We can also notice that the use of this red color spreading everywhere is also highly inflammatory and emotional. Here is another example of what Claire Waddle defines as imposter content. It's when a public figure's account or organization is imitated to spread false information. Here you see a false BBC Twitter account, which has been tweeting about Boris Johnson's death. When you give a close look to the account, you can see that the name of the account actually looks tricky. It's at BBC Breaky. It's always important to look at the sources. That's one of the instincts that one should have as an investigation for online investigation. The account name, the name of the author of an article, the name of the organization, etc. Manipulated content is becoming more rare as it is nowadays much easier to flag with tools such as reverse image search, for example. Here you can see how the photo has been manipulated to add a mask to the State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sudan to fuel narratives of anti-Asian sentiment at the beginning of 2020. Fabricated content, completely fabricated content, is also easier to flag nowadays by fact checkers and less effective than it used to be a couple of years ago. It is still very effective, though, to fuel inflammatory content and hate speech. Here are some important characteristics of disinformation trends and techniques that we have been seeing lately. Bad actors want misinformation to move across platforms from one platform to the next. Misinformation and hate speech are increasingly blurring. Keyword squatting is a known technique that I will get into in more detail later on. Imposter content, such as the BBC account we saw, is very effective. We also saw a lot of false documentation with the label of the WHO, for example, spreading all lots of different kind of false information. And attribution is really hard. So let me give you some more details about these points. Keyword squatting is a term that was coined by Joan Donovan and Brian Friedman from Harvard. It's the strategic domination of keywords to misrepresent groups, individuals, or information. We have seen how the idiom "save the children," for example, the name of a big NGO, has been used by QAnon campaigners and followers to support their own messaging. Keyword squatting is only one of the tactics and techniques used by actors of disinformation to reach their goal, which is get maximum amplification for their false information. Claire Waddell has theorized this in what she calls the trumpet of amplification. The idea is that creators, for example, of conspiracy theories, are using the leverage of our digital space to progressively make their way from the anonymous web to the professional media. And they sometimes succeed to do that. This is another reason why we have to be, why we have to be extra careful in what we are sharing online, keeping in mind that even the fact-checking of false information can sometimes contribute to giving more oxygen to it. Another thing to consider about the impact of mis and disinformation is the way its repetition erodes trust over time. This WSJ infographic shows how Donald Trump has been tweeting about illegal voting regularly since before 2013, intensifying his attacks progressively until 2020. We can see the same kind of impact around the pandemic, during which repeated attacks on vaccines, including conspiracy theories, progressively seem to lead to more vaccine hesitancy. This gets back to our example on satire and parody and how this can sometimes be very borderline. We have seen last spring how a parody website of Joe Biden, created by a political opponent, by the way, had actually been more viewed than the actual real campaign website of Joe Biden. It collected more views because several articles were done about it in big news outlets and mentioned the parody website, even if they identified it as satire. And thus they made it much more visible to the wider audience, with the risk that the parody aspect of the website would not be understood or even lost in the process of amplification. I now want to dig deeper about the mis and disinformation trends and tactics we have seen around the pandemic. The World Health Organization started talking about an infodemic around the pandemic early in the year. This infodemic leading to more confusion with short and long-term effects on the citizens and even governments' decisions and behaviors around the pandemic. We identified 4 trends of misinformation around COVID-19 quite early on in 2020, all linked to uncertainties and data voids around actual credible information on these teens. So they are the origin of the virus, how it spreads, symptoms and treatments, but also citizens and authorities' behaviors around the health crisis. Although we now have a bit more credible information around some of these themes, such as how the virus is spreading, for example, or some of the treatments and possible symptoms, a lot of questions are remaining. And these uncertainties continue to fuel misinformation and conspiracy theories to fill in the voids, because that's what we are all craving for. Our brains need explanations. This is particularly true in terms of crises that have such an intimate impact on people's lives, on our lives. Our feeling of being powerless around the situation makes us highly vulnerable to these kind of explanations that we would like to see a way on how to cope with the situation. This is humane and understandable, and as journalists and researchers, as providers of information, we need to take this into consideration in how we are fabricating information. This, for example, was found by my colleague in the US, Shay Urbani, as it circulated in her neighborhood. So the first message on the left was spreading on WhatsApp about scam door-to-door testing for COVID-19, claiming that this would be fake and linked to possible criminal action. This message, understandably, was fear-mongering and worrisome. It circulated so much that it actually forced the local authorities to confirm that no door-to-door testing was organized. The police department itself had to weigh in to explain that there was indeed no door-to-door testing, but that they also did not get any reports of someone being a victim of fake door-to-door testing. The unfounded rumor on WhatsApp actually achieved to get 2 local authorities to address it officially. That's another example of the trumpet of amplification I showed you earlier on. Now, this example comes back to the important matter that I will address later on this presentation, the question of headlines. In this example, we see how the question of a headline contributes to spread the theory claiming that the virus would have been man-made in a Chinese lab, even if actually the article itself explains the contrary in detail. The harm is done by the headline, because this is all we read. So we don't have anything to prove that the virus was man-made or in a lab, or we don't have anything to prove the contrary at this moment in time as well. As a dear colleague of mine is saying, assumption is the mother of all errors. We have to keep that in mind continuously. Misinformation also grows by traveling from platforms to platforms and countries to countries. Translation, and sometimes bad translations, play an important role in this process, even when there is no intention to harm in the first place. Here we see how a press release and an article published in China about a particularly deadly outbreak of COVID-19 in Kazakhstan, as a tiny story, was then amplified by other media outlets at global level with the false claim, linked to a false translation, that the outbreak in Kazakhstan would have been caused by a virus more deadly than the COVID-19 itself. It traveled all the way to reach outlets in Latin America, creating fear and inflammatory headlines. As we have seen before about Donald Trump and illegal voting, narratives build over time. Our team identified lots of conspiracy theories surrounding the figure of Bill Gates and his involvement in vaccines and epidemic research. This hasn't been going on for a long time, building on Bill Gates' talks, as well alerting on the possibility of a global pandemic, but also on memes and the representation of Bill Gates as a powerful elite figure from the US and the West in general. His image has been used as a voodoo doll to channel feelings of anger and doubt. If you want to know more about how narratives build over time and how this might lead to a problem around vaccine hesitancy in 2021, here is a very interesting podcast from the New York Times with a strong focus on the US, but also about how the trust in vaccines and also health institutions generally has been eroding in the last years, and specifically since the pandemic. Influencers, as major figures of the digital age, also play a crucial role in the spreading of disinformation and information in general. We have seen, for example, how a famous vegan chef and a singer became figureheads for COVID-19 related misinformation in Germany, as it shows on the slide. How to reach out to influencers, how to count on them as allies in the fight against information disorder rather than amplifiers. At First Draft, we did start some work around this, so it's the early stages. I mean, we did a first project with Spotify to reach out to podcast influencers with some general knowledge about misinformation and disinformation, and tools and tips to try to reverse this trend. We have seen how, in a very stressed and fragile ecosystem, lines become blurry between misinformation and hate speech. The beginning of the pandemic has come with an increase of anti-Asian sentiment, as I was describing before, but then also an anti-foreign sentiment in China when the outbreak was stronger in Europe and the US. This is also how misinformation has real-life impact and why we need to take action on it as much as we can. The surge of hate speech and misinformation also affected health workers in Europe, and we saw how in the UK and France, for example, some health workers suffered from rejection and as potentially contaminated people or as part of a system that would deliberately work to make people die. This conspiracy theory claiming that COVID-19 is made by the elites to terminate some part of the population is ongoing and often reused in relation to vaccination campaigns, for example. Now, let's talk about ways to try to slow down the spread of misinformation. One way to do that, even if you're not a journalist yourself, is to consider the matter of responsible reporting. As I said, you may not be a journalist, but you are sharing information online. I mean, we all are sharing information online all the time. So that makes you responsible for what you decide to share. There are ways to privilege credible information and to try to slow down the spread of misinformation. For all people aiming to provide accurate information, it is important to look for data voids. Michael Golubievsky of Microsoft used the term data void to describe search queries where the available relevant data is limited, non-existent, or deeply problematic. It is thus by looking at what web users are searching for online, thanks to tools such as Google Trends, for example, that it is possible to proactively identify data voids. It is also essential to learn more about conspiracy theories, by which mechanism they are born and how and why they spread. This book by Stefan Lewandowski and John Cook can help you to dig deeper into that matter. In the meantime, there are three main aspects to note on why conspiracy theories work so well. First of all, because they serve as coping mechanism in face of uncertainty, as I mentioned before. They also satisfy a need for a big event to have a big cause. They dispute and question mainstream views and allow us to believe we're part of an enlightened minority. One of the questions we ask ourselves when we are reporting on mis and disinformation is, has it reached the tipping point? Is the coverage of this story fit for public interest, or will it only amplify the misinformation itself? Amplification by mainstream media is a goal for creators of misinformation, as we saw with the trumpet of amplification. Journalists and people who share content online generally have to keep this in mind. Questions to estimate the tipping point are following. First of all, numbers. How much engagement is the content that we are looking at getting? Travel. Is the content moving from one community to the other or from one platform to the other? Influencers. Did an influencer share it, in which we can imagine that it's going to reach out to far more people than it has done until now? And outlets. Are journalists, news organizations, NGO or governments writing about it? These can vary between cultures and contexts for each piece of information, and only you can find the right balance of what reaches the public interest point in your own ecosystem. I mentioned this before. Headlines play a big role in the amplification of misinformation, even when sometimes the aim of the actual article is to verify false information. Let's look at this example. You might have heard about a video of Nancy Pelosi in the US being slowed down to make her look drunk while giving a speech. Well, this is one of the headlines that was chosen to report on it and on the fact that Donald Trump shared the video on Twitter. Do you see what the problem is with this headline? As a reminder, studies show that lots of people actually only read the headline of an article without reading the article itself. Reading this specific headline, there is nothing to prevent you from believing that Nancy Pelosi was indeed not in her right mind when she gave this speech. And that's what the audience walks away with, or at least that is the risk we are taking when we are sharing such headlines. We covered the fact that people's attention is drawn by their emotions. Let's not forget about the incredible power of images. Pictures of empty shelves in shops and protective suits, as the ones which emerged at the beginning of the pandemic, were fear-mongering, adding fuel to the fire and the panic. I don't know if you recently experienced this kind of images in Sweden as well, but in mid-October, we saw images of empty shelves and panic buying again starting in the UK. This is not helping and also not what we need in terms of information, especially in a time of crisis. Some people believing in conspiracy theories might already have the vision of a world divided into some sort of dishonest elites versus the good people. Usually in that worldview, the mainstream media is seen as playing a part in these dishonest elites. Using mockery and derogatory language, as you can see in these headlines, for example, could actually contribute to push some people further away from the trust they might have in the media. In terms of ethics, and when covering topics such as mis and disinformation in the digital world, it is also important to take into account that our coverage can have real-world consequences for the people or witnesses mentioned in our report. The same kind of awareness is, of course, crucial for any kind of content we are sharing online. Could this content be used to harm the people I am talking about? That's something to keep in mind. During last spring, we were looking at ways to cover the pandemic in a less stressful way to avoid the images of empty shelves that I was showing just before, with images of positive behaviors towards the situation rather than always pointing out the failures. Our director found this image bank of positive images around vaccines, which could be a way to go forward and show us a way to develop more positive images that we could use around the pandemic, for example. To wrap this up, this very quick overview on mis and disinformation and ways to slow it down, there are a couple of resources I would like to share with you so you can continue to dig in if you want at your own pace. So you can find all of our resources online, free to access on our website, so firstdraftnews.org. You can also register for our daily and weekly newsletters, which will give you a lot of daily analysis on online misinformation trends that our team is monitoring in the UK, in the US, in France, in Europe in general, but we do not speak all the European languages in the team. So we are talking less about Sweden, sadly, than about France or the UK. But we hope, if we are in touch with you, to be able to fill that gap. APAC and India as well. You will also find some recommended reads and events updates on these newsletters. For those of you who want to start playing around with online tools or who are playing around already, we have a toolbox of free online tools, for example, verification and monitoring tools that we are keeping updated very regularly. And that is available either on your desktop or on your mobile. We also have a course that we did put together for journalism covering the coronavirus in bite-size and very easy to access. And it's going all the way from tips and tools for online investigations to mental wellness and vicarious trauma and how to protect yourself as a journalist or as a newsroom in the time of the pandemic. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this has not been too long. I am now going to join you for the answers to your questions, if you have some for me. Thanks again to the For Your Institute for inviting me to talk to you on the behalf of First Draft. I hope that this has been useful to you all. Thanks, Anders, as well, for organizing this. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Marie. And I'll jump right to the questions. There has been a couple of them coming in, but please let them continue coming in. We have time for questions and answers. The first question was really, it came already in the beginning of your presentation where you were talking about that a lot of the disinformation and misinformation going on is actually happening in closed messaging apps. So as a journalist, would you say that you need to pretend being someone else to get into those closed groups and to be able to debunk or investigate these?
So we did a couple of webinars about that that you can find online in much more detail than what I'm going to say now, especially about WhatsApp and also another one about TikTok, which is not closed but could be interesting as well in terms of messaging app. So it really depends on the types of group that you are going to look at. If you are looking on groups that are particularly sensitive and to generate disinformation in a permanent way, let's say, or in a very divisive way, like including hate speech, for example, or including some strong topics, then it's probably better to use a burner phone and make sure that you protect yourself as much as possible to avoid being harassed online afterwards. But we also try as much as possible to and because we want to consider ethics around that, to be transparent about it as well. So if you're going to a group, because that's also where misinformation is happening in a much more discreet way, maybe. If you are going to a group of, I don't know, breastfeeding mothers or local nurses or parents from the school, or this is where misinformation can be shared in a much more pernicious way, and this is where you can actually disclose your identity in a much more easy way as well. So it really depends, on the type of groups that you want to be investigating. And one of the recommendations also of my colleague Rory Smith, who has been doing quite a lot on WhatsApp, is that you should also always know what you are looking for before you start investigation on closed groups, because otherwise you can get completely lost in it and also like losing a lot of time, but also being a target much more that you would like to if you get lost in it.
Yeah, I can fill in there because tomorrow we will have a workshop about researching TikTok here during the conference. And we will also have a session about how to protect yourself when you are working online. So this fits perfect together. And I think also Vik Foss tomorrow surely will talk about how the mind is working when you are taking this disinformation and misinformation on board, how we tend to trust people close to us and so on. I have a question or do you have more questions?
Well, go ahead and we'll take this one later.
Yeah, about the narrative. Tomorrow we will have a group discussion here just about narratives, how you are building a story with headline and picture and so on. Do you have some advices to give us before that work?
Well, most of the advice I gave already in the presentation in terms of headlines. I think one advice that is really important that we have been seeing in terms of fact checks, for example, is that sometimes a fact check, when it is done and it's saying, for example, oh, this information is false, it's actually not helping, because if you don't give more context about, like, if you just say it is false, first of all, there is a risk that the people who are not believing that it's false are not going to believe you more, because it's hurting their point of view, that you're not giving any more explanations to that, but just saying, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and that's all. So that's not a constructive conversation. And then the second thing is that if you just say something is false, but you don't give an alternative to the rumor itself, and you don't fill it with accurate information, then it creates another information void, where actually more conspiracy theories and more misinformation can be born. So that's probably the biggest one, is really to make sure that you don't leave your article in the end with more open questions than the contrary. And that is particularly difficult to do at the moment of the pandemic, because there are so many open questions that we need to probably all collectively learn how to talk about science, how to talk about research, how to talk about the fact that it's not done in a day, and that it's okay to have some questions open for a while. So yeah, that's something.
Thank you.
There's another question from the participants about the American election. MSNBC and also other networks interrupted Trump in his last speech, saying that he was telling untruths. Wouldn't this only increase conspiracy theorists? Wouldn't it have been better to fact-checking during his talk or just afterwards?
In a way, I think you're right. I think that the fact of interrupting his speech probably is reinforcing the worldview of certain people. But at the same time, what we saw, for example, when we did the Cross-Check France project with media organizations from lots of different backgrounds and different political angles coming together and being transparent about their investigation and the steps of the investigation, actually it helped to restore some trust from people that were from all kind of political backgrounds, because there was such a mixity of media organizations coming together and telling the same thing. So in a sense, I think that the fact that I think, I'm not sure, but I think that Fox News also did cut down Trump's speech. The fact that so many different TV channels would take the same decision can also help to kind of say, well, enough is enough, and this is something we won't let happen anymore. So again, it's a balance to find, I guess, and you can't have everyone on your side, but as much as possible, I think that the fact of different media working together can only help to restore some trust.
Can I fill in there? I mean, if this was easy to solve this with disinformation and misinformation, we didn't need to have this conference. It's so hard, and it's so many levels and different parameters to take on board. But you said something about several media houses taking the same decisions in the same time. Is that something you can try to formalize or build up a strategy or something? Some kind of cooperation between media houses?
again, I think it's a matter of context. Sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not. I know that, for example, in New Zealand, there was also a common decision of media organizations to cut down on the how do you say that, on the claims of the killer of the terrorist attack, and this was understood by some part of the population, I think, within New Zealand, but was also criticized by other medias around in the world, saying, "Oh, well, you're not covering the entire story." So, yeah, again, it's a difficult balance. Yeah. I know as well that in Germany, for example, there is this claim from, especially from the extreme right wing, that all mainstream media would be together to cover up Islam problems or things like that, which they call the Lügenpresse, which makes them probably more reluctant to do any kind of formal public collaboration. But in France, it worked pretty well, because the media came together around this idea of public service, because it was just after the Brexit referendum campaign and just after the election of Trump. So maybe that also helped in the media coming together and taking a stand on this. We are, for example, we are working on collaboration with media now, but we are not making it particularly official for now, because we also want to restore the trust between media in their collaboration before we can get official about it. But I mean, that's really the idea, because as I said, we did a research that showed that actually people were convinced that when they see people coming together and being transparent about the investigation, it's actually helping to restore trust.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question here about a little bit of the historical perspective on disinformation and fake news. The people that are purposely creating disinformation online now, where were they before social media? Could you give a bit of a historical perspective?
So I'm not sure I'm the best place to give a historical perspective on that, and that's going to be like very personal. First Draft doesn't share any real historical perspective on that. What we just see is that social media helps to amplify these conspiracy theories and disinformation trends like much more, and that the fact that the social media are working in silos is actually contributing to that in quite a heavy way in terms of worldviews. But historically, I mean, we know that rumors have always existed. We know that they are part of societies, and yeah, I mean, it's nothing new in the end. So, and I think that the motivations were exactly the same before. I mean, some people probably have been creating some rumors because of fear, because they wanted explanations for this or that, and because they wanted to get back control on what was happening around us, and they could what was happening around them, and what they could not explain with a specific rationale. And then some other people did it for money. I think that money is still a very big motivation. But yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot go into much more details in terms of a historical perspective, but I think it has always existed.
Thanks. Another question about the voids you spoke about. You cannot write a story that covers all voids. At the same time, you can see that disinformation exploits voids in journalistic reporting. Which voids should one be aware of?
That's interesting. I think that, as I was trying to explain before, we try to proactively look at some voids in the fact of, like, for example, using Google Trends helps us to see what people are searching for online. And sometimes the articles that are done, and you know that the media has this tendency to all cover the same things at precisely the same moment. sometimes it's completely missing the point of what people are actually looking for online, which is something completely different. And maybe that's the voice that we should prioritarily look for, is what are people looking for online? What are their research queries like? And how can we fill in these voids with some accurate information as much as possible?
Thank you. Any more questions from you, Annelie? There's nothing at the moment.
Yeah, the money thing, that's so many, that it could be a big motivation to act in this ecosystem with disinformation. Can you explain a little bit more about that, the different aspects of the money motivation?
So I'm not a specialist on the matter, but what I can say to you is that, for example, one of my colleagues in France has been identifying some Facebook groups that are really, really big and have a lot of followers that are talking about very divisive topics in the French politics that are usually associated to prominent right-wing politicians, extreme right-wing politicians, that are spreading disinformation about any kind of topic you can find that is really divisive, such as 5G, vaccines, Dr. Raoult, that you must have heard of, that we famously famous for now in France. So every kind of topic is covered by these specific networks. And when you actually go back to who is creating these Facebook pages, it's actually some people in Ukraine or in Poland. And they are using these networks to get back to links to their own websites where they are selling all kinds of stuff. I mean, could be t-shirts, could be things like that, but also I guess that they are, and I don't know exactly how, but they are counting on the fact that they are going to create a lot of engagement by posting very divisive topics to make more money in terms of advertising. I think that's a major key in social media. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm not able to go into more detail about the specific mechanism to make some money out of it. But I think that's basically the idea.
Yes, thank you.